Right, welcome to another car-based video, and I have the laptop with me because I've got the memory of a sieve. And basically, these are going to be mine and a couple of my mates' guilty pleasure cars. Now, basically what this means is they're cars that we are guilty of wanting to own because they're either a bit terrible, or they're hated, or they've got a bad reputation, or we shouldn't really want to own them for several reasons. And I'm going to run through. So I've got just under about 10 of mine. In total, there's probably about 12 or 13 cars. But I'm just going to call it the top 10 because it's nearly 10 for me because I would cross a couple of cars over. So I'm going to go in alphabetical order of mine. Then I'm going to go to the 4 that they've recommended in alphabetical order. And basically, we're going to start with one of mine. Well, this is probably one of the least guilty pleasures because they're not hated as much as the rest of the cars, but I'll basically explain it. And that is the original Aston Martin Lagonda. Now, if you know what that is, it was a massive saloon car from the 1980s. And it was very controversial in its design. It was a bit rubbish to drive. It was slow, and it didn't really look particularly beautiful, and a lot of people dislike them. And I don't. I think they're quirky. They are incredibly quirky. They're cool, and that's why it's in this list, because it's not a very well loved car. I mean, there's people who do love them, but there's a lot of people who don't. They're a very Marmite vehicle, and they were a bit crap. They only had like 300 horsepower, and they're heavy cars, so they didn't really move. But I like them. I think they're cool. But it's one of the least ones that I would say are on this list. There's a couple on here that you'll be like, especially with one of my mates as well. It's quite funny. Anyway, the next one is the Audi A2, which is a car that I think is one of the cars that gets the most unnecessary hate of any vehicle in production car history. Why is the blue text up to the bottom of my laptop? And that is because it was genius. Well, in the fact that it was compact, it was light, had good fuel economy, it was affordable, and it all made for a decent package when driving. It was fairly okay, decent car to drive, right? And realistically, people hate them because they didn't really do very fast, but they were really slow, and they were a bit dull. And the looks are a bit controversial, but I like the way they look. I actually think they look quite good now. I think eventually there's going to be a point where we go, yes, they do look quite cool. But they get a lot of hate. Like the Fiat Multipla, the Audi A2, the original A-Class, they get a lot of hate. Now, fair enough, the A-Class and the Multipla specifically, because it's really ugly. But all 3 of those cars, I think, get unnecessary hate because they were all very similar to each other. They were fuel efficient, they were spacious. They were pretty innovative in their designs as well. Like the Audi was lightweight. The Mercedes had that engine that went under the passengers to stop it going into the cabin. And the Multiple had 6 seats and it was spacious and it was quite good in that aspect. But they get a lot of hate. And the only one of the 3 I would like is an Audi A2. But that is one of my guilty pleasure cars because I'm guilty of liking them because they're hated so much. And but I would genuinely get pleasure from owning one. So that's exactly what this means. Some of these are probably borderline, I will admit, because it's quite hard to think of some. But here's what it is. The next one's probably one of those borderline ones. And it is the BMW E36 or E46 Compact. I would say the E46 Compact is the most hated of the 2 because of the way it looks. I really like an E36 Compact. There's a Dakar yellow one near me, and it looks so good. I'm like, I want that car. But basically, they were small versions of the E36 and E46, and people dislike them because of the way they look. They didn't drive particularly brilliantly compared to the bigger brothers, basically, and they were just a bit dull. But I think they're cool. I quite like them, and they're very popular drift cars as well, because they're obviously they're quite compact. They're very light, but they're rear-wheel drive, so people use them a lot for drift cars. The E46, I would say, is the one that's hated the most, though, because of the way they look, obviously, which I've already said. But they were a little bit ugly. I actually think the E36 looked quite good, but the 46 didn't, and that's why they're hated. But I do quite like those, and I would own one, and not many people would admit to doing that. So anyway, that's probably the most borderline of those, of the lot. The next one is, we're going a bit French now. This is where the guilty pleasure started, the French cars as well. So we've got a couple. We've got French and Italian, I would say, are the two. The Citroën C6, because it's a guilty pleasure vehicle, because I would own one over an Audi or a BMW or a Merc, and most people wouldn't, and most people dislike Citroën, and I think they're awesome. I love the way the C6 looks. I think it looks brilliant, right? The thing is with the C6 it wasn't actually a bad car. There was not really anything wrong with it, except from it was a bit dull. I think it looked fantastic. It was quirky. The diesel engines were pretty decent. It was incredibly comfortable being a Citroën because of the suspension stuff they use. And I was like, they're sick. Why didn't it take off? But the thing is, it's a guilty pleasure because it's a sales disaster. Because people didn't want to buy it because it's Citroën. And you can't admit to owning a Citroën C6 over an Audi A6 or a 5 Series. You just can't do that. That's why you don't. I have not yet seen a DS9 on the road, which is basically the modern day version of a C6. I've not yet seen one, and I see a lot of cars on the road. I see C5Xs all the time, which are them like crossover sort of, but it's still an estate. It's like a high-rise estate. I see them quite often. I've never seen a DS9, and I'm not surprised. In 10 years, 15 years, that's going to be somebody's guilty pleasure vehicle, because it'll get hate because it isn't a BMW or a Merc or an Audi, and it's trying to be one, but it's better than them. The C6 was a great car. But anyway, French quirky cars are cool, and people don't like to admit to owning them, and people don't buy them because the reliability is actually quite terrible sometimes, and they're expensive to run, expensive to maintain, and they're a little bit annoying in that regard, but I would own a C6 because I think they're cool. The next car is genuinely a guilty pleasure because, firstly, the one version of it is hated and slated by everyone, and it was a genuinely terrible car. It didn't have anything decent going for it. It was a bit crap. And that is the Chrysler Crossfire Convertible. Now, I will stress the convertible only because the coupe was hated, and like everybody hated it because it looked like a dog parking its bottom, as said by Jeremy Clarkson, because it was ugly. Now, it was slow, it was dull, it had an automatic gearbox, and was based on an old Mercedes SLK, and it wasn't particularly good to drive, and the coupe obviously was incredibly ugly, and it was obviously a nightmare to run and maintain because it had Mercedes engine, so the parts were expensive, and it was an American car, so it was built like a bin, literally like it was built like a wheelie bin. It was shocking, but the convertible looks fantastic. I see them all of this, like a couple. I don't say all the time because they didn't sell very many because there was a sales disaster in the UK. But I see a couple of convertibles every now and again. See the coupes and they look crap. But I see the convertibles, and even with the roof up, I think, God, that looks so good. They look fantastic. I love the way these look. And for just cruising around with the roof off, with about 200, because they've got about 240, 250 horsepower, they're not incredibly slow, they're not very fast, they do 60 about 7 seconds, but they're not like dreadfully slow. The gearboxes are a bit crap, but nevertheless, they look fantastic, and for just cruising around in, they're cool. If you can get one in that burgundy sort of colour, yes, that is it. Chrysler Crossfire Convertible. And I shouldn't admit to wanting to own one because they were poo, but I like them. I think they're weird, and there's probably some people who sat at home now going, "You are a weirdo for liking Chrysler Crossfire Convertible." I know, but they're quite cool. Anyway, the next one I'm going to get absolutely slated for, but I quite like the DS5, the Citroën DS5. Then became the DS5 and then they cancelled it. But yet again, another big executive large French luxury vehicle that was a sales flop. Not as big of a flop as the Citroën C6 because I see DS5s every now and again, but I don't see Citroën C6s. Basically, it was like the cross between an MPV, a crossover, and an executive saloon car. And basically, it's confusing to get your head around. They did a hybrid version, and they did a diesel hybrid actually, and it was a bit crap. But I would have the petrol version with 200 horsepower. You could do 146 miles an hour, which is pretty good for like a big MPV. So it's pretty fast. 0-60 in about 8 and a bit seconds. Not bad. Now, most people, these cars, a lot of people call them ugly. Now, I didn't they are. And a lot of people wouldn't buy them because it's a big French luxury car and nobody wants to buy a car like that. They obviously don't have the best reliability record, being a big French luxury car, and they have catastrophic depreciation levels like any big French luxury car. So a lot of people wouldn't buy them, but they're my guilty pleasure in the fact that I'm guilty admitting that I want a big luxury vehicle that is often regarded as ugly and was a sales flop, and also depreciation was terrible. But I will get pleasure out of owning it because it's big, it's roomy. The petrol version was pretty quick, and I think that they're cool as hell. So yes, why not? Why don't I own one? So, well, no, I'm not going to, but I would quite. I think they're cool. Bear with. I've missed one of the cars off. The bottom. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to round this up to 15 because I think I will have enough then. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. Yes, I'll round it up with one that there's about half on half actually. I can't even spell that. Right, there we go. So there's about 5 actually that have been submitted via. 6 that have been submitted by my friends. So anyway, on to the next ones. Last couple for me. The next one was actually a joint one between me and my friend Ewan. So it technically counts as one that's been added, but I also agree. And that is the Lancia Thema 832. Now, why is this a good special car? Because it was terrible. It was also expensive, it was slow, it was unreliable, and it didn't look particularly good compared to other Lancias. Why would I get pleasure from owning it? Because I like the way they look, I like the way they drive, they were quite cool, and it had a Ferrari V8 under the bonnet of a 4-door saloon in the 1980s. You couldn't, like the M3s, and well, the M3 wasn't really out, but you know what I mean, like in the 90s. The cars of the time were boring 4 cylinders, and they didn't have, like, this had 240 horsepower from a V8, I think it was a 308 engine. It was cool, it had a big V8, and even though it was expensive and slow, and very unreliable, and didn't look as good as other Lancias, but I still think it looked good. I'd love an 832. The turbocharged 4-cylinder version of the Lancia Thema was as fast, more reliable, cheaper to buy, cheaper to run, cheaper to fuel, less bad on depreciation initially. And they're actually I think they're slightly rarer, the turbo versions. But it's a good special kind that I'm guilty that I want a V8 powered Lancia saloon car because they're crap. But I really, really want an 832. I genuinely would say it's in top 20 cars, I would say, ever, that I would own. If I ever become that rich. But they're not actually that expensive, so who knows. To run and maintain, yes, that's partly the reason why a lot of people hate them. Anyway. The next one is another Italian exotic car, and I mentioned this in last week's video for a video I did about the 5 cars I regret not buying. But, or last time, the video from last, might have been a week ago, I don't know. Anyway, that is the Maserati BiTurbo, because if there's one Italian exotic car that you can say every single person, every man and his dog hates or dislikes or doesn't want in their life, it's the Maserati BiTurbo. Because, like the Lancia Thema 832, it was slow, unreliable, it was boxy, it didn't look particularly good to most people, and it was a bit terrible by the standards of the day, even with a twin turbocharged V6. But it was innovative in the fact it was the first production car ever made with twin turbos, hence the name BiTurbos. It was the first car ever you could go out and buy from a dealer and drive on the road with 2 turbochargers on the same engine. Voila! That's why I want one. Now, why is it a good pleasure? Basically, I'm guilty of admitting that I want one because they were terrible cars. They like the original ones had a 2-litre twin turbocharged V6 with about 185 horsepower. They did 60 in about 8 seconds. They were slow. That's like even worse than the Thema 832. Let's put that out there. By the time, like, the problem is Maserati went bust probably 900 times in the lifespan of the BiTurbo. So it had different names, like it was the 430, and then it had the 222, the Zagato Spider, and all that jazz. Like it had several different, the Quattroporte it was named as, with 4 doors. And basically the design stayed exactly the same until about the late 90s, when the Ghibli and the then Quattroporte, which had a V8 at the time, bowed out. And I think the Chamol as well was another version of it. And they did loads of versions of the same car, and they tweaked the design very slightly. But basically, the same boxy BiTurbo lasted a while. And then they put in a 2.8-litre twin-turbo V6 with about 300 horsepower, brought it up to more performance standards. Did it up a little bit. By this, I think they were owned by Citroën at one point. God knows, probably owned by the postman around the corner the next week. Who knows? It was Lancia in the mid-90s. Could have been owned by anyone. Prince Charles, maybe. Who knows? Basically, they kept the same design, and everybody criticises them because they were really they were poor cars, and they were expensive, and nobody really knows which one's which, and which one was built by Citroën, and which one was built by the postman or Prince Charles or anything like that. Nobody really knows, and they were crap, and they were slow, and they were unreliable. But eventually, they did change the design, and they stopped producing the same version of the same car. Basically, what happened is the Maserati BiTurbo went through the same thing that the Porsche 911 did, but failed badly, whereas the 911 succeeded. I don't know. But anyway, I would love a BiTurbo, and I would get pleasure out of owning one because the noise they make is phenomenal, and I love the way they look. I like the boxy styling, because I like boxy cars, if you've probably not noticed. There's an Aston Martin Lagonda on there, and an E36 compact, and an Audi A2, all a bit boxy, aren't they? Basically, my car taste is basically what happens when you go into an IKEA warehouse. It's just boxes. Anyway, I think the last one of mine is a less boxy vehicle. And that is, I shouldn't admit to this, owning the car I do, but I have started to, let me bottle waters there, to become quite fond of the NC MX-5. Now, I own a Mark 1 MX-5, if you don't know. There's not many people that don't know. I think the entire world probably knows. And in my opinion, that is the best MX-5. In my opinion, the worst MX-5 is the NC MX-5. But I would still quite like to own one because the NC MX-5 is a bit poo stock. It's a bit heavy and it's a bit slow. But they're brilliant when they're tuned. And I think the pre-facelift 2-litre 6-speed LSD, perfect spec, looks the business. And I would quite like to own one. At some point, well, I don't know whether I'd quite like to own one, but I think they're quite cool. I think they might age well. And they're still good cars, and they still only weigh like 1,200 kilos. So they're not that heavy, really. And you can tune those engines up to pretty decent power. So I would like to admit I do quite like the NC MX-5. Right, we'll run through the last ones dead quick because don't don't want to leave this too long. Basically, these were submitted by my mates. So, we'll start off with Leo, who's got the Volvo 480. I don't know really why this would be a guilty pleasure car. I assume it's because of the way it looks, and it's not been it's not a very popular car. It didn't sell in many numbers. So that's his. Dylan submitted quite a few cars. Actually, no, I'll go on with Leo's other car, actually. He has the Daihatsu Copen. Now, that's a guilty pleasure car because you don't want to be seen driving a Daihatsu Copen. Nobody does. Dylan's consists of some quite funny cars. So, I will start with the BMW iX, which we discussed in our Bad Automotive Opinions, and he said it looked good. It doesn't. It's the ugliest car I have probably ever seen in my entire life. I've seen some pretty ugly cars. And it's an EV as well, so it's being catered to all those petrol heads. And to be fair, it's not actually that bad of a car. It's just the way it looks is horrendous, and that's why. But it's his guilty pleasure because he likes the car. I assume. His other one, I don't really understand why, but it's the Ferrari FF. I think he said every time he mentions it, people criticise him. I think it's because I don't think they look particularly good. And I think it being a 4-seater, like estate Ferrari, it was a bit of a weird choice for Ferrari to make, and possibly something along those lines. But they're actually quite good cars, but I think it's mainly the looks with the FF that's the problem with them. The next one is quite cool, the Mercedes R63, because nobody admits to wanting to buy a 6.2 litre V8 powered 500 horsepower 6-seat MPV. Nobody does, because it's a stupid idea, and it looked a bit crap, but it had 4 exhaust pipes and I can do 60 in 5 seconds flat. It's pretty cool. That's a good one. That's a really good one, because it's a guilty pleasure because you don't want to admit to owning what was actually quite a bad car, not in 63 form, and you don't want to admit to owning a big MPV Mercedes. But who doesn't want a 6.2 litre natural aspirated V8 powered MPV? It is awesome. Anyway, the last one is the funniest one, and we're ending with it because it's the best one. His ultimate guilty pleasure vehicle that is guilty to admit to wanting to own, but will still obviously get pleasure from owning, is the Vauxhall Sintra. And I think that's all I can say about that. Goodbye.